The Murmillo. This heavily armed fighter was one of the most recognizable figures in the Roman arena. Originating in the early imperial period, the Murmillo took his name from a type of saltwater fish, reflected in the distinctive fish-shaped crest mounted on his helmet. He carried a large rectangular shield called the Secutor, a short stabbing sword known as the Gladiatorus, and wore armor protecting his sword arm and lower legs. What made the Murmillo so fascinating was his deliberate pairing against lighter, faster opponents, turning each fight into a visible contest between raw power and agile strategy. Crowds immediately understood the dynamic the moment both fighters stepped onto the sand. The Thraex. Named after the fierce warriors of Thrace, this gladiator type became one of the most beloved by Roman audiences. The Thraex fought with a curved blade called the Scissor, designed to reach around an opponent's shield and strike from unexpected angles. His own shield was notably small, a square buckler that offered far less protection than what the Murmillo carried. This asymmetry was intentional. The Thraex relied on speed and cunning rather than brute defense. Historical records suggest the Emperor Domitian was so personally devoted to this fighting style that he would reportedly punish spectators who dared cheer for opposing types. That kind of imperial favoritism speaks to how deeply these fighters captured the Roman imagination. The Retiarius. No gladiator looked more unusual entering the arena than the Retiarius, and that was entirely the point. Armed with a weighted net, a long trident, and a short dagger, he wore almost no armor at all, leaving his upper body completely exposed. He originated as a deliberate theatrical contrast to the heavily protected fighters he faced. The strategy was pure movement: cast the net to entangle, then drive the trident forward before his opponent could recover. Roman audiences found this combination both thrilling and slightly unsettling, because the Retiarius resembled a fisherman rather than a warrior. That sense of the unconventional made him one of the most debated fighters in the entire gladiatorial tradition. The Secutor. Designed almost entirely as a counter to the Retiarius, the Secutor was essentially a specialized evolution of the Murmillo. His helmet was smooth and rounded with only narrow eye holes, specifically engineered so the net of the Retiarius could not catch or grip it. Every design choice was deliberate. The narrow eye slits protected him from the trident's prongs, while the streamlined helmet reduced the chances of entanglement. However, that same helmet severely limited his vision and airflow, making exhaustion a serious threat. Fights between the Secutor and Retiarius were structured as a chase, one man constantly maneuvering to entangle, the other relentlessly pursuing. Roman crowds considered this pairing among the most dramatic spectacles the arena could offer. The Hoplomachus. Drawing direct inspiration from the classical Greek hoplite soldier, the Hoplomachus carried a long thrusting spear and a small round shield, presenting a deliberately archaic image in the arena. Rome had conquered Greece, yet Roman culture remained deeply fascinated by Greek military tradition. This fighter embodied that complicated admiration. He also carried a short sword as a secondary weapon for close-range combat once the spear became impractical. The Hoplomachus was typically matched against Murmillo or Thraex fighters, creating visual pairings that carried symbolic weight for educated Roman spectators who recognized the historical references embedded in each contest. What looked like entertainment was also a living lesson in Roman dominance over the ancient world. The Provocator. Among all gladiatorial types, the Provocator stands apart for one striking reason: he was the only type permitted to fight exclusively against his own kind. Two provocators would face each other, both equipped with a visored helmet, a breastplate called a cardiophylax, a rectangular shield, and a short sword. This symmetry created a fundamentally different kind of contest, one of pure skill and stamina with no stylistic advantage available to either fighter. The name itself means challenger or one who provokes, suggesting these bouts carried a personal intensity that asymmetric matchups did not. Some historians believe the Provocator developed from Roman military training traditions, making his fights feel less like theatrical spectacle and more like genuine combat trials. The Dimachaerus. Carrying two swords simultaneously, the Dimachaerus was a rare and spectacular sight in the arena. While most gladiatorial styles relied on the balance of offense and defense through a weapon and shield combination, this fighter abandoned the shield entirely in favor of a blade in each hand. The style demanded extraordinary coordination and physical conditioning. Evidence for the Dimachaerus is more fragmented than for other types, appearing in scattered written sources and a small number of artistic depictions, which itself tells a story. These fighters were likely uncommon enough to be genuine arena events rather than regular features. When a Dimachaerus appeared, the audience would have understood they were watching something genuinely unusual, even by Roman standards. The Essedarius. Chariot fighters carried a particular kind of mythology into the Roman arena. The Essedarius derived directly from the chariot warriors encountered by Julius Caesar during his campaigns in Britain, and Rome found the concept exotic enough to import it into the spectacle of the games. Fighting from or alongside a chariot, the Essedarius represented a foreign military tradition transformed into entertainment. Over time, as the style evolved within the arena context, the chariot element may have become more theatrical than tactically central, but the origin story remained part of the appeal. Caesar himself had documented these warriors in his accounts of the British campaigns, giving the Essedarius a direct connection to one of Rome's most celebrated military figures. The Andabatus. Blindfolded or equipped with a helmet containing no eye openings at all, the Andabatus fought without the ability to see his opponent. This was spectacle stripped to its most absurd and brutal extreme. Two fighters would be sent into the arena essentially unable to locate each other except through sound and instinct, sometimes prodded toward each other by arena attendants to prevent the fight from becoming entirely stationary. Ancient sources mention this type with a tone that suggests even Roman audiences found it darkly comic rather than heroic. The philosopher Seneca referenced the Andabatus when criticizing those who live without reflection, suggesting the image of a blind fighter swinging wildly was a recognized cultural shorthand for purposeless struggle. The Laquearius. Closely related to the Retiarius in spirit, the Laquearius replaced the throwing net with a lasso, fighting with a noose designed to catch and pull opponents off balance. Where the Retiarius sought entanglement, the Laquearius sought control, yanking an opponent's limb or weapon arm to create an opening for the short blade he carried in his other hand. This required precise timing and spatial awareness, since a missed lasso left the fighter temporarily exposed. Evidence for the Laquearius is limited, and some historians debate whether he represented a distinct official category or simply a variation practiced by individual fighters. Either way, the image of a lasso-wielding gladiator speaks to how inventive the Roman arena could become in its search for new spectacle. The Velitus. Named after the light infantry skirmishers of the early Roman army, the Velitus brought a javelin into the arena, fighting at range before closing for direct combat. The original Velites of the Republican legions had been the youngest and poorest soldiers, fast-moving skirmishers who opened battles with volleys before retreating behind the heavier lines. Translating this into gladiatorial combat created a fighter whose opening moves looked nothing like what Roman audiences saw in most bouts. The Velitus could disrupt an opponent's approach before the real contest even began. This style was likely paired carefully to maximize the visual contrast, because a javelin throw in the confined space of the arena carried immediate dramatic impact. The Scissor. One of the most mechanically unusual fighters in the entire Roman tradition, the Scissor took his name from the distinctive weapon strapped to his right arm, a semicircular blade mounted on a metal sleeve that replaced the conventional sword. This device could hook, trap, and shear an opponent's weapon or limb with a rotating motion. The Scissor was typically matched against the Retiarius, and the pairing made immediate visual sense. One fighter relying on a net and trident, the other carrying a blade specifically capable of cutting through net material. This was arena engineering at its most deliberate. The Roman games producers understood spectacle deeply enough to create fighters whose very equipment told a story of counter-strategy before the bout began. The Gallus. In the earliest period of Roman gladiatorial history, the Gallus represented a captured Gallic warrior forced to fight in the style of his own people. This was not simply entertainment but a public demonstration of Roman conquest, staging the defeated enemy's own fighting traditions as arena spectacle. As Rome's relationship with Gaul evolved and Gallic peoples eventually became Roman citizens, the type faded from the records. A fighter embodying a conquered enemy became politically complicated once that group was no longer considered foreign. The disappearance of the Gallus from later sources is itself historically revealing, showing how gladiatorial categories were not fixed entertainment categories but living reflections of Rome's changing relationship with the world beyond its borders. The Samnis. Among the oldest recorded gladiatorial types, the Samnis took his name from the Samnites, a central Italian people who fought Rome through a series of brutal wars in the 4th and 3rd centuries before the Common Era. Dressed in Samnite military equipment, including an oblong shield, a visored helmet with a plume, and a short sword, this fighter transformed a military enemy into arena theater. Once the Samnites were fully absorbed into Roman civic life, presenting them as enemies became inappropriate, and the type was gradually restructured into the Murmillo and Secutor categories that carried forward the same equipment tradition under new names. The Samnis, then, was not just a gladiator. He was a historical record written in armor. The Arbelas. Named after a shoemaker's crescent-shaped cutting knife, the Arbelas carried a half-moon blade attached to his forearm, similar in concept to the Scissor but distinct in its curved geometry and cutting application. This fighter appears in only a small number of ancient sources, making him one of the more mysterious entries in the gladiatorial record. The name itself is Greek rather than Latin, suggesting this style may have originated in the eastern provinces of the empire before traveling west to Rome's arenas. Details remain genuinely scarce, which means reconstructions are partly interpretive. What survives suggests a fighter who relied on precise slashing motions rather than thrusting, creating a style that would have looked visually striking and technically demanding to Roman spectators. The Paegniarius. Not every arena appearance ended in blood. The Paegniarius was a comic performer who fought in exaggerated mock battles between serious bouts, carrying a whip and a stick rather than lethal weapons. These fighters provided tonal relief in programs that could otherwise become relentlessly grim, and their performances likely involved theatrical falls, exaggerated reactions, and crowd interaction. The distinction between Paegniarius and genuine gladiator was understood by everyone present, yet the training required to perform convincingly was still considerable. Roman arena events were carefully programmed experiences, and the placement of these lighter interludes reveals a sophisticated understanding of audience management. Even the most bloodthirsty crowd needed moments of release before the next serious contest began. The Crupellarius. Described by the Roman historian Tacitus in accounts of a Gallic revolt in 21 CE, the Crupellarius was a fighter encased almost entirely in iron plate armor, covering the body from head to foot with interlocking metal panels. Tacitus noted that during the revolt, these heavily armored fighters proved nearly impossible to wound but were equally unable to injure their opponents effectively and collapsed from their own weight when knocked down. The description reads almost like an early account of the practical limits of full plate armor, a problem medieval knights would wrestle with centuries later. In the arena, the Crupellarius would have been a spectacle of impregnability, but Roman audiences knew that immovability was its own kind of weakness. The Noxii. Set apart from trained gladiators by one fundamental distinction, the Noxii were condemned criminals executed publicly in the arena rather than trained fighters competing for survival. Sentenced to death by wild animals, by fire, or by being forced to fight one another without proper weapons or armor, they occupied the lowest position in the entire arena hierarchy. Roman law specifically classified them as people without legal rights, and their deaths were framed as justice rather than entertainment, though the boundary was thin in practice. Scheduled during midday when casual spectators often took a break, these executions were considered less prestigious than the main gladiatorial bouts. Their presence in arena programs reveals the extent to which Roman public spectacle was inseparable from the exercise of state power. The Venator. Distinct from gladiators proper, the Venator was a beast hunter who fought wild animals in what Romans called the venatio, meaning the hunt. Lions, bears, bulls, leopards, crocodiles, elephants, and rhinoceroses all appeared in the arena for these events, sourced from across the empire's vast territories at enormous expense. The Venator was a trained professional, typically armed with spears and wearing lighter protective equipment suited to agile movement rather than direct combat with another human. Some Venators became genuine celebrities, with names and records preserved in inscriptions. The sheer logistical scale of sourcing exotic animals from Africa and Asia for these events reveals how deeply Rome was willing to invest in demonstrating its reach over the natural world itself. The Bestiarius. Where the Venator was a skilled hunter, the Bestiarius occupied a more ambiguous position, sometimes a trained specialist, sometimes a condemned prisoner armed barely enough to make the contest appear fair. The distinction mattered to Roman audiences who understood the difference between a professional performance and a public execution dressed as sport. Trained Bestiarii developed genuine expertise in animal behavior, learning to read the movements of lions and bears with the kind of precision that kept them alive across multiple appearances. Some evidence suggests specialist schools existed for this training, separate from the facilities producing conventional gladiators. The Bestiarius reminds us that the Roman arena was not a single type of event but a complex program of carefully calibrated spectacles, each carrying its own rules, expectations, and performers. The Meridiani. Fighting during the midday interval when the main program paused, the Meridiani were gladiators of lesser status who filled the gap between the morning animal hunts and the afternoon's headline bouts. Ancient sources, including the philosopher Seneca in a famous letter, describe arriving at the arena during this period and finding the contests brutal and without skill, fighters sent out simply to be killed for the crowd's amusement during what was meant to be a rest period. Seneca's discomfort with what he witnessed reveals the full spectrum of what the Roman arena contained. Not every fighter was celebrated. Not every bout was a showcase of training and courage. The Meridiani existed at the point where Roman entertainment most honestly revealed its appetite for violence without pretense or ceremony. 21 types of fighter. 21 different answers to the same question Rome asked every time those iron gates swung open. What does it take to survive? The Roman arena was never simply about violence. It was a mirror held up to an entire civilization, reflecting its obsessions, its conquests, its hunger for spectacle, and its complicated relationship with courage and cruelty. Each gladiator type carried a story far deeper than the sand they fought on. Some were celebrated heroes. Some were condemned men given a weapon and a prayer. Some were living symbols of defeated nations, forced to perform their own history as entertainment. Together they built one of the most extraordinary spectacles the ancient world ever produced, and 2,000 years later we are still uncovering what it truly meant. If you found yourself drawn deeper into this world with every fighter we uncovered, then you already know there is so much more history waiting beneath the surface. Drop a comment below and tell us which gladiator type you found most fascinating, and let us know what hidden chapter of history you want us to pull apart next. If you want more videos that go beyond the surface and uncover the stories history textbooks leave out, subscribe and stay close. The next discovery is already waiting.